So my talk is Google Marxism, the internet ideology, and the academics who perpetuate it. And I just want to make clear that I'm talking about, when I say capitalism here, I'm talking about dirty capitalism. Big digital consists of an array of political and social interests, an ensemble of technology companies and internet services, but not limited to the Apple, Google, YouTube, Amazon, and Facebook. Big digital wields enormous economic political power, presiding over big data and serving as the chief arbiter of expression with power to affect the digital and dangerous persons. This is big digital. These are the major corporations. With power to affect the digital deletion of dangerous persons from its various platforms, as the Gulag was the means to physically disappear dissidents and other thought criminals from normal life in the Soviet Union. In my new book, The Google Archipelago, I recall the Google Archipelago of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's literary masterpiece while referring to a singular system of interconnected digital producers or islands. In suggesting a comparison between Google and the Gulag with its own set of archipelagos, I don't mean to say that Google is an emblem for the big digital giants of big digital, and the Gulag, a massive prison system of the Soviet Union, can be understood as equally punitive or horrific. One was a vast network of arbitrary, brutal, elaborate, and torturous penal camps and special settlements turned into an organized system of terror and exploitation and forced labor. The other is a vast constellation of digital giants with enormous economic and governmental power, but no physical torture, incarceration, forced labor, or immediate prospects of facing a firing squad. Yet I certainly do mean to draw an analogy. As the Google Archipelago had once represented the most developed set of technological apparatuses for disciplinary and governmental power and control in the world, so the Google Archipelago represents the contemporary equivalent of these capacities, only considerably less corporal in character to date, yet immeasurably magnified, diversified, and extended in scope. The principles of what I call big digital are not only monopolies or would-be monopolies, but also will either continue to be incorporated by the state or become elements of a new corporate state power. If only augmentations of existing state power, the apparatuses of the big digital combine to produce the Google Archipelago, which stands to effect such an enormous sea change in governmental and economic power, inclusive of greatly enhanced and extended capacities for supervision, surveillance, recording, tracking, facial recognition, robot swarming, monitoring, corralling, social scoring, trammeling, punishing, ostracizing, unpersoning, or otherwise controlling populations to such an extent that the non-corporal punishment aspect of the Google Archipelago will come to be recognized as much less significant than its political impact. In particular, the Google Archipelago is guided by a left authoritarianism. The significance of this corporate left authoritarianism will soon be made clear. Given this characterization of the Google Archipelago, which is supported by evidence in my book, non-academics with a fervid or even modest interest in the phenomenon of big digital would find the academic digital media scholarship as akin to the scholasticism of monks quibbling about minor points of theologies during the Inquisition. As for me, I knew the literature fairly well when I set out to write Google Archipelago, having taught digital media studies for 15 years. The academic digital media scholars, whom I call the digitalistas, are so blinkered by Marxist and post-Marxist approaches that they miss the most salient features of the field they study. Namely, its sharp and dangerous turn toward authoritarian leftism. This is an unfortunate circumstance because the problem with the internet is leftist authoritarianism, of which Marxism is the main variety. While one can find nary an academic article treating the blatant double standards of big digital in favor of leftists or left liberals, the digitalistas jockey for position to proffer the most novel and anti-capitalist interpretations of the digital sphere. The denizens of the internet, or netizens, are treated as super-exploited non-working workers within a system of digital capitalism. The digitalistas descry a super-exploitive and pernicious digital capitalism almost exclusively aiming to offer the best leftist explanations of the field. The greatest crime, as the digitalistas see it, involves the facilitating of neoliberalism via the extraction of, quote, free labor from unwary netizens. The digitalistas and other leftists see so-called neoliberalism as a kind of stealth campaign underwritten by anti-statist economists like us, whose aim has been the transfer of public goods and services into private hands, preferably at bargain basement prices. As public services like schools, fire departments, the police department, and the highway system, the tragedy of the digital spaces is their commodification, a further sign that the capitalist order is asymptotically approaching the libertarianist dream and the socialist nightmare of complete privatization. Drawing on Alvin Toffler's notion of the prosumer, a hybrid producer-consumer who supposedly labors without pay while consuming, the digitalistas bemoan the transformation of digital commons into a digital labor camp. As they see it, web surfing amounts to exploited labor. The digital giants extract surplus value from the hapless web surfer who mistakenly thought that he, she, or Z was having a good time, only had to have his, her, or their search histories sold. Of course, the validity of the labor theory of value on which, quote, exploitation rests is mostly, if not entirely, unexamined in these studies. If it is scrutinized, the LTV is only a miss where the digital realm is concerned, and a new basis for exploitation, such as effective investments, is found. According to the digitalistas, when users open Facebook accounts, the dumb Fs, as Mark Zuckerberg once referred to his subscribers, freely divulge valuable demographic information that Facebook then sells as data to advertisers. As such, they are exploited. When they post status updates or comment on the statuses of others, Facebook users produce, without pay, the content that Facebook sells to advertisers, which means they are exploited again. When conducting web service searches, the hapless and unwitting, unwaged slave laborers of digital capitalism produce data that Google sells to advertisers, jockeying for ranking position, exploitation. With almost every form of online activity, quote, a form of labor exploitation therefore occurs, albeit one based on voluntary and non-coerced acts of labor. Or as my favorite horror storyteller of the left, Michel Foucault, puts it, albeit in the context of internalized surveillance, the unpaid digital laborer, quote, becomes the principle of his own subjection, end quote. If you think that my characterization of digitalista Marxism is exaggerated, have a peek at an essay entitled Capitalism, Patriarchy, Slavery, and Racism in the Age of Digital Capitalism and Digital Labor by the Marxiest of all digitalistas, Christian Fuchs. In his essay, Fuchs draws parallels, although admitting differences, between 4 forms of unpaid labor, 3 of which are productive, that meaning they produce commodities for sale on the market. These include housework, reproductive labor, slavery, and posting on Facebook. The following passages are by no means ripped out of context, and therefore my quotations do not, quote, enact violence upon the text, nor should I hope on the reader. Slave labor, reproductive labor, and unpaid Facebook labor have in common that they are unwaged, but by being integrated into capitalist society, they nonetheless create surplus value. Whereas the wage worker has a contractual and legally enforceable right to be paid a wage for the performed labor, slaves, houseworkers, and Facebook workers do not have such a right, which enables their exploitation as unpaid workers. Mind you, by Facebook workers, Fuchs means anyone who uses Facebook. That includes me, for one. The capture of data as a result of the labor of web surfers is hardly the horror show that the digitalistas make it out to be. I've known dozens, if not hundreds, of Marxists who regularly spent 10 to 12 hours a day complaining on Facebook about their exploitation as part of the working class. If their Facebook statuses have contributed to the environment for ad sales, this hardly strikes reasonable people as a matter of grave concern. On the other hand, if the Google archipelago does involve a partial privatization of state functions, then the most troubling aspect is not the smaller size of the state or the loss of state services, but the flip side, the governmentalization of private enterprise. As an appendage of the state, if not in fact acting as a surrogate for it, the Google archipelago also involves the expansion and magnification of state power. The digital constellation increases the state's capacity for surveillance, information control, censorship, and banishment or unpersoning of persona non grata. Since leftist ideology is dominant in academia and the internet, academic and other leftists cannot see the authoritarianism in their object of study, any more than they can see it in their very midst. Their ideology, that is in the university, their ideology is invisible to them as the air they breathe, and thus they are unaware of its function. So I remind them of what the French structuralist Marxist Louis Althusser argued in Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses. Captives of ideology are never able to recognize their own ideological convictions as ideological. The dominant ideology is as invisible to believers as the air they breathe. What seems to take place outside of ideology, to be precise, in the street, in reality takes place in ideology. What really takes place in ideology, therefore, seems to take place outside of it. That is why those who are in ideology believe themselves by definition outside of ideology. Ideology never says, I am ideological. This allows ideology to exert its power. If they were able to recognize their own perspective as ideological, they would thereby elude ideology. But since the victims of authoritarianism are their political enemies, the digitalistas appear to be unconcerned as the Google archipelago hastens the disappearance of places to exercise the right of free speech. Ironically, the disappearance of so-called public space was once a major concern of leftist academic media scholars. Even the phrase used to describe the space, public space, the commons, is a political leftist metaphor that in the early days of the internet was bandied about as the utopian ideal. But under the spell of ideology, the digitalistas missed the main features of this digital zeitgeist. As such, the digitalistas produced decoys, false criticisms, and simulated radical critiques of the Google archipelago. They substitute oppositional posturing and attempt to preclude other more comprehensive explanations of the Google archipelago by suggesting that the problem is capitalism, which necessarily must be countered by some form of socialism. The digitalistas aim to appear as the ultimate radicals. Meanwhile, their scholarship serves precisely to obscure the authoritarian leftism of the Google archipelago. Contrary to their self-conceptions, the digitalistas are ideologues. They are ideological appendages of the system itself. They serve rather than undermine the digital empire.